Hello, and welcome to Effective Strategies for Launching a Diversity and Inclusion Program. My name is Stephen Huerta. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Workify. After a brief hiatus in the fall, we're back up and running with our Fireside Chat series. Thanks to everyone that's joined us in the past and for coming back. What a great topic to kick things back off, diversity and inclusion. It's certainly something that's near and dear to my heart. Over the summer, there was a huge surge in activity that we had never seen, deploying many diversity, equity, inclusion surveys. As we worked through the initiatives with our clients, we collected great data, and we noticed that many times clients they had challenges in terms of understanding how to move the conversation forward, and more specifically, like how do you launch a new or revamped diversity inclusion program. And so our guest today is going to offer us great perspective on the topic, given her experience. I'm really excited, but before I introduce her, let me first take a look at the discussion topic itself. And as always, I like to start the conversation with some numbers. And so let's first take a look at the pressure cooker that 2020 has brought us.
Yeah.
So over the summer, we got hit by what I call the perfect storm. We were several months into a global pandemic. So let's just sit and reflect on that for a sec. Like, this is something that we had never seen. And then we started to see that some diverse groups were getting hit particularly hard. And I think this slide does a great job. I mean, these numbers are pretty staggering. Specifically, women have experienced heavy job losses due to the pandemic. We've all had to shift the way that we balance our work and our personal lives. Homeschooling has been a huge impact, and clearly that has impacted women at a rate much higher than men, based on some of the numbers that we're showing you here. Additionally, non-white ethnic groups have become sick and are dying of COVID at a much higher rate. These statistics are alarming. And lastly, the summer of 2020 brought about what could be considered the largest protest movement in history, with the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and everything that escalated over the summer, really triggering protests across the nation like we haven't seen it in quite some time. Mm-hmm. But with that being said, there was already a critical lens on diversity and inclusion programs. I found in my research, preparing for this, a great paper by the Boston Consulting Group, top tier firm, called The Diversity Disconnect. And in this paper, they highlight how unconscious bias needs to be an increased area of focus as executives and leaders continue to believe that their organizations are further along in the diversity and inclusion effort than what's the reality is. And additionally, if we just look from a pure numbers and metrics perspective, this is Black Americans in executive and leadership positions. The numbers are still lagging, and I think that's something that HR practitioners are well aware of. So to re-summarize, we entered 2020 with a lagging progress, a growing focus on Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements, only to have our worlds completely disrupted by the events of 2020, magnifying the challenges that we were already facing. So our goal today is to discuss how you can, with all the challenges that we've been encountered with, how you can further the diversity and inclusion conversation, some common mistakes that executives make when investing in diversity and inclusion, and some measures of success that will help you really create a lasting impact. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. From a housekeeping perspective, we're going to spend about 35 to 40 minutes on the conversation. Your feedback has told us that we need more time for Q&A. So we're going to try to get through the conversational piece as quickly as we can, and then open it up. So a reminder to please submit questions along the way. You've got a great resource today, and we really do want to answer as many questions as we can. So without further ado, I'm super excited about our guest, who is a personal friend of mine, a former colleague, and just an all-around amazing person, Monica Marquez. Monica is the co-founder and chief innovation officer at Beyond Barriers. She's led diversity and inclusion initiatives at some of the world's best companies, such as Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Ernst & Young, and Google. Throughout her career, Monica has pioneered industry-leading programs to help disadvantaged gain breakthrough access to opportunities. Monica is active in a variety of nonprofits and currently serves on the Hispanic Scholarship Fund board. So welcome, Monica.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here and having a conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled to have you. And clearly you've done some amazing work over your career. And what it really excites me about our chat today are the perspectives that you bring. So thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely.
So
Conversation.
before sorry to cut you off, before we
No,
jump in, I'm eager to learn more about Beyond Barriers and some of the great work that you're doing. Can you share with us kind of your mission and the amazing work that you're helping clients with?
absolutely. I mean, I think, it ties into everything that you were saying in terms of thinking about what do organizations need to do. And for me, one of the passion projects that I've always worked on, no matter what role I was in at any of those organizations, was focused on women's initiatives and really how do you, as you know, the World Economics Forum in the last couple of years have had updates to their research. And the first number that they came out was that it was going to take over 150 years to, or 189 years to get gender parity in terms of
Wow.
equity, and pay. Then they came back and they said, actually, that number has increased and it's 257 years. And so with that, I was like, okay, we shouldn't have to wait more than 2.5 centuries to get equal pay and equal opportunity for women. So my company, Beyond Barriers, what we have done is we are democratizing executive coaching and leadership training for women in organizations, really for that group that sometimes doesn't get that help, which is that middle kind of, as you move into your career, you get a lot of help when you first onboard, you enter an organization very junior, and somewhere in
Mhm.
the middle, you don't get as much support. And that's where you see high attrition. And then, a lot of the programs and organizations like myself focused on the more senior kind of high performing women. And so it's like, how do you close the gender gap by increasing that leadership pipeline, by taking that critical mass of women in the middle and helping them level up? So
Well,
that's what we do in a nutshell, is really
yeah.
trying to increase the leadership pipeline with the talent you already have worked really hard to bring in.
Well, it's interesting hearing you share all of that. At first, love the work you're doing. But I recall just reflecting on my own career, it is that kind of middle tier where you're trying to break through, and it feels
Yes.
like there are unspoken rules within the company that some people know, but not everyone, and you're trying to figure it
Yes.
out, but you're trying to execute on your actual day to day.
Mhm.
So that's an amazing mission that you guys have. So you've been a consumer, a practitioner of diversity programs. You've also worked on the corporate side. Now you're an entrepreneur in the space. What
Yes.
is it about this work that really fires you up, that you love so much? Because it's tough work.
Yeah, it is tough work. And I think part of it is because, I lived it. And like you mentioned, I
Mm,
mean, you and I both know, being first generation, college, or even first generation corporate, it's really
mhm.
difficult to navigate an organization or a culture, a work culture that you don't have support, or, just legacy people that can kind of tell you, hey, this is what you need to do. And and I've always been, so one of my not monikers, or what a lot of, here at Beyond Bears, what they call me is the MacGyver for the marginalized. So, I've always been passionate about figuring, out ways to create opportunities for marginalized groups, be it, women, Latinos, Blacks, LGBTQ, disability, you name it. Just figuring out, how do you make sure that we are allowing or creating a culture where people can be their authentic selves. And really, because the research has proven time and time again, when an individual can bring their whole selves to work, they are 30% more productive than when they are trying to cover something or be something that they're not. And so at the end of the day, what I tell leaders and managers is like, listen, do you want 30% more productivity in your, from your employees? And if the answer is yes, then adopt an inclusive work environment. And this is how we do it. So yeah, I've been super passionate about that, and really teaching people to, D&I strategy is, it should be a strategy that's aligned with a business strategy at the end of the day.
Absolutely agree. And a lot of what we're going to talk about is how you do that in
Yes.
practice. And so, I'm just curious. I know that having, relatively recently jumped into the entrepreneur space with your startup Beyond Barriers,
Yes.
can you tell me a little bit? I know you guys, there's a lot of activity and what you do is in high demand. What are some of the conversations you're having with leaders on this topic?
That's a really great question. I mean, we saw a huge spike, especially in the summer with George Floyd, and a lot of the just what we saw with individuals getting out there and really kind of being very vocal as to something needs to change. And like you said, there had always been a focus on diversity and inclusion, but I don't think there was truly a spotlight that hit it until
Not like
everything that
this.
happened at that time. And
Yeah.
so, a lot of leaders were in this kind of like, okay, a bit of a back burner, or we're just doing, what we need to get done to check the box. And I think this kind of shone a really big light where there were some big gaps for organizations. And so, I immediately was bombarded by requests of, hey, how do we launch? How do we launch a strategy? How do we do all these things? And unfortunately, diversity and inclusion isn't something that you can just microwave and kind of like, hey, let's roll it
Nope.
out there. I mean, you need the data. You need to really understand your organization and your population and understand the demographics of your organization to say who needs what and what is going to be the most impactful thing for us to do. And you can't really make a lot of decisions unless you have the data to make informed decisions. Because a lot of the times what happens is, you get people coming in saying, okay, well, let's just throw in unconscious bias training, or let's just, launch ERGs, or let's just do
Right.
this. And it's a combination of things. But at the end of the day, you have to make sure you have to focus on the outcome. What do you want to come out of the strategy that you are, that you're rolling out, and why? And make sure that we were doing it for the right reasons.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. As HR practitioners, I think this is the topic that we all stand behind. But it can be a hard pitch, right?
Mhm.
And for years and years and years, depending on the level and size and industry or whatever, just the culture of your business, we've been pitching. We need to focus on diversity and inclusion. We need to focus. We need to invest more. You're
Yes.
not getting a response, and then overnight, executives and leaders are like, all right, we got to do
Yes.
something about this,
Yes.
go. And it's not that simple. And so
Mhm.
this is going to be a great conversation, just because I think that a lot of our audience have probably felt that pain. So, well, with that said, should we jump into the conversation?
Let's dive in.
All right, let's do it. Well, the first discussion topic or kind of trend, and that's really how we like to organize these conversations, is some provocative statements or views, and then we'll go more into the kind of the tactical side of things. And so the first statement here is, I have an opinion, but I'm really interested to get yours. And the statement is, diversity has never been a more divisive topic.
Mhm.
What do you think about this? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is this overly dramatic?
You know, I would say, the divisiveness is real. Because at
Mhm.
the end of the day, as a leader, diversity and inclusion is difficult because you're trying to change hearts and minds, and you're challenging people's belief systems. And so
Mhm.
that's where the divisiveness comes in, is that, on one hand, if you're rolling out DNI, you are going to, in some cases, make people feel uncomfortable,
Mhm.
which is the majority group, right? And on the other
Mhm.
hand, if you choose not to roll out DNI programs, then you have another group of people who are upset because they aren't feeling heard, they're not feeling seen, they're not feeling understood. And so the divisiveness, is real. And unfortunately, you're not going to get away from it as a leader. So you have to make an informed decision as to why you are going to decide one way or another to roll out DNI programs, and have to feel good about that decision. And as leaders, we all know when you decide, you divide. You're going to have 50% that are happy or not happy, or the other half that's not happy. So you can't get away from that. And it's just given the fact of, combination of the health crisis, political elections, the pervasive racial inequities, it really puts a lot of
Mhm.
people on edge and it makes them uncomfortable. And, diversity and inclusion is just something that makes people feel uncomfortable. And so we tend to be, the human race tends to like to avoid sometimes that uncomfortable feeling. So
And,
it's really
and
up
do
to the
you
leader.
And do you think the digital shift, or one of the great things about the business world today is we have these tech stacks, specifically the people tech stack or work tech stack that has created channels for feedback. The ability to have a voice today is a lot easier. Do you think some of that is playing into it? I mean, because I not a lot of people know, but my role today is very different to some of the roles I've had in the past. And in 2010, I was tasked to implement diversity and inclusion. This is still when I was on the corporate side,
Yeah.
and I rolled out diversity and inclusion programs with a great friend of mine, Rosanna Dorothy, at a real estate finance firm. And and I will tell you, it was divisive then in
Hmm.
2010, but for some reason it just has a different feel today. And it if I'm an HR practitioner, it requires some courage to kind of go into these conversations and try to create a common ground. And so I'm just curious, what do what views do you have on like what exactly is causing that?
Well, I totally agree with you. I think, social media and, people can now, there's a little bit of everything. There's this if there's this like feeling in the air now that you can be as vocal as you want to be, and there's not
Mm.
that much of a censorship anymore. Like you have the right to, to say what you want to say or say what you feel. And it's much easier to say that when you are saying something that might be divisive or might be, offensive, because you can hide behind your computer now, right? And the
Mhm.
difference is that we've always had these like suggestion boxes, right? And you could leave something anonymously and leave it in there, but it's only the group or that recipient who was going to see it, right? And in some cases you could hide some of those things where you knew that like, wow, if this got out, people would be really upset. And in social media now, people are posting it and it's there for the world to see, and it becomes viral. And then, people get disheartened because you're like, I can't believe somebody would say something like that. Or, but at the end of the day, it's just like, I think people, those opinions and those beliefs have always been there, but they were in a sense suppressed, right? And then,
Mm.
there's this sense of people feeling emboldened now to,
Mhm.
say what they feel, but not understanding the repercussions that come with that, right? Because we've seen a lot of people take to social media and then, it goes viral and then they didn't realize the impact, right? That what they said had and then at the end they're like, oh well, I didn't intend for it to offend people, but at the end of the day the impact is what matters, and the impact was offensive, and so now you have to deal with the repercussions. So I think social media is definitely added fuel to the fire.
Yeah, I agree.
You and I as a DNI practitioners know that there's always been that resistance a little bit because of that uncomfortableness, right?
Right.
And there's just, if people want to grow and evolve, there's going to be pain involved, right? Change is hard, it's difficult. And like I tell people all the time, I'm like, they don't call it growing pains for anything, right? If you want to grow and you want to evolve and you want to be better, then you are going to have to go through that change, and it's going to be painful and in some perspectives.
Yeah, I have found that people fear what they don't understand,
Right.
or what they misunderstand, and we'll go into some of the reasons why programs fail here in a little while. But I believe that that's a huge part of it, is just like the finding a common understanding. And so
Mhm.
how do you navigate that? Like how do you in what would you what do you have to offer to the practitioner that wants to lean in, but then again this could be you could be walking into some landmines. And the reality is we need to lean in, and the
Mhm.
time is now. There's this huge opportunity. And so how do you think that you can start doing that in a way that will kind of balance all the different perspectives on this topic?
Well, first and foremost, you have to meet your people where they're at, right?
Mm,
And that can be hard to determine with, if you're not really doing the research or really kind of, doing surveys internally in your organization to really understand where are your people, how do they feel on some of these topics, or, do they feel that it's an inclusive work environment? Do they feel supported by their manager? Do they feel seen or heard, or any of those things? um, and understanding where they're at. And then, after, getting that pulse of where they're at, then doing a little bit of, trying to understand and make sense of the data and validating it by having conversations with groups of people to say, hey, what is what, like, help us understand, what would be helpful. And then thinking about, how are you positioning diversity and inclusion in your organization? Are you making it this taboo thing that people feel like it's, punishment? Like, oh, you need D&I training because you're not an inclusive leader, because you're seen as racist, or you're seen as discriminatory, or whatever.
mm,
It shouldn't
yeah.
be that at all. You
Mhm.
have to think about, how do you create a culture where D&I is embraced because they realize that it is aligned with the business strategy. How can D&I help the bottom line? And you have to be very deliberate and strategic in doing that. And so really understanding, what is the vision and mission of your organization? What is it that
Mhm.
you're selling? What is it that, at the end of the day, what drives the bottom line, and how can you align D&I strategies to match that? And what I mean by that is that a lot of the times D&I is seen as kind of this add-on or this afterthought of like, oh, we need to, like, do some D&I training because people are saying they don't feel welcomed, or they don't feel, whole. But if you position it differently and saying, hey, we've been doing some research and we found out that, inclusive leaders, or people who feel like they're being led by inclusive leaders, tend to have, better solutions. And
Mhm.
all in all, 6 percentage points higher of whether it's revenue or market share or any of those types of things, those leaders do better. So
Right.
wouldn't you like to do better? And how do you align your strategies to do that?
Right. Yeah. And I think that that is a great example of how you can start creating that alignment, or just creating the awareness that this is bigger than just a training course
Right.
that I'm going to have to, that you're going to require that I sit in.
Yes.
One of the other things that, because it's interesting, you mentioned, conducting a survey, and, and this is going to sound weird because I work for a data and feedback company, but
Mhm.
that's not always the right first step to take.
Right.
And because that can be seen as like, wait, where is this coming from?
Yes.
Why am I getting this survey? And so one of the things that we've seen, some of the companies that we work with that have done this really really well, we'll start the conversation, we'll just
Mhm.
start a conversation.
Yep.
Some of this isn't particularly rocket science, but communicating that we are aware that we need to do better in this area, including creating a shared understanding of what diversity and inclusion means for our company. And in the near future, you will be seeing, we will be unveiling more. And it's important that we get your view as well. So just
Yes.
like starting with a
Yeah.
communication, and that way there's some context for employees. We've seen that be really really successful. And just really quickly, one of the things that you mentioned in some of in our prep work for this session was this concept of the 6 foot fence. Can you
Yes.
share? I just think it's a brilliant way of looking at this, and creating a common view. Can you share a little bit more about this
Yeah.
what you were
So,
sharing with me?
as you start rolling out D&I programs, and very much like you said, you should be having the conversation, whether it's, your employee resource groups, or there's just various groups coming to you, and getting that anecdotal data first of like, hey, there's something going on, we need to dig deeper, and then looking for the empirical data.
Mhm.
And then you start rolling out programs, right? And sometimes you get the what about me-isms, especially when you start rolling out, you have a women's network, you have a Latino network, a Black network, all of these networks. Then you start getting people coming to you saying, hey, what about me? And a lot of the times too, you'll get men who'll come and say, hey, what about the men's network? And so I usually like to tell the story of like, look, they were like, I thought we're about equality, just treating everybody equal. And I'm like, well, there's this fallacy of thinking about, just equality as the answer. It's
Mhm.
not. So at the end of the day, it's like, okay, you have a male who's 6.5 foot tall. You have a woman who might be 5.5 foot tall. And then you have somebody else who's 4.5 feet tall. And there's a
Mhm.
6 foot fence and they need to see over it to get, to watch the game or something, right?
Yeah.
The 6.5 foot tall guy can already see over the 6 foot fence, right? And if
Mm.
we say, let's be equal, let's treat everybody equal, here's equality, everybody gets a 1 foot stool. Well, the 6.5 foot guy can already see over the fence. The 1 foot stool certainly helps the 5.5 foot person because now they can see over the fence. But the 4.5 foot person with the 1 foot stool still cannot see over the fence. So it's just like, okay, well, rather than give the 6.5 foot guy one stool or everybody one stool, you give the 5.5 foot person one stool and the shorter person two stools or a two
Yeah.
foot stool so that they
Yeah.
can see over and everybody now can see. And that's the concept of equity. Like, so at the end of the day, I explained to them, yes, we may be doing more for women or we may be doing more for these marginalized groups, but it is because they don't have the same advantages. There's not that equity. So I could sit there and say, let me launch a men's network too. But at the end of the day, how is that really helping them create a level playing field and create that concept of equity, not
Right.
equality? And
Yeah.
so a lot of
Equity
the
versus
times,
equality. It's
yeah,
great.
yeah. And so a lot of the times they'll stop and think and say, okay, I get it. And it minimizes that what about meisms. And I think that's what a lot of people, leaders struggle with is that if I start doing this for this group's going to come to me and say, what about me? And if you talk to them about the idea of we're embracing equity, not necessarily equality. I mean, it's almost the same thing, but there's a subtle difference. Then they kind of
Mhm.
get it and they see like, okay, I understand that.
Well, and I wanted to make sure that we shared that with the audience because I think in the conversation itself, there is this programming, this
Mhm.
pre-existing wiring. When the topic of diversity and inclusion comes up, it's like, oh, this is about equality and affirmative action and all the
Yes.
the original roots, some of the original roots of these of the topic,
Hmm.
and that's not the case.
Right.
So, well, I'm getting a wave from the digital wave from my marketing team to move along, and we could keep talking about this. So
Certainly.
let's
Yes.
move to the next discussion point. And this is another great statement for conversation, and that is most diversity programs fail.
Hmm.
What do you think about this statement? I know we've both been faced with challenging comments like this, and do you think this has any merit?
You know, yes and no, because I think when it fails, it's because there hasn't been thought really put into how are you aligning this, or there's a misalignment with the way they rolled things out or the way they communicated things to the organization, right? And at the end of the day, they saw kind of D&I in this kind of like siloed way where they weren't thinking about how does this align to the overall organizational strategy and the overall goals? How is D&I going to supplement and help, us reach, the ultimate North Star? So I really think that, having to understand that you need a D&I strategy, but it can't be kind of off on its own. It needs to be aligned and tied to the organizational strategy at the end of the day. And how can you make sure that your organization is leveraging that diversity of thought and that, and just the value that bringing that different perspective to product solutions, to service solutions, to all of those things, our managers really truly pulling that into everything that they're doing. And as I had shared with you before, like more inclusive leaders have 6% higher margins, and it's shown time and time again when you have more women in leadership roles that these publicly traded organizations see that they have higher revenue marks too, because they are leading with a diverse kind of leadership leadership in and mindset, and it's giving them an advantage. So there is an advantage to the bottom line when you do embrace that idea of diversity, but it's how are you communicating that to your organization? And like I mentioned before, if you're going to be positioning it as something punitive, for leaders, and they are feeling like D&I is more this mandatory thing, check the box kind of thing, then it is going to fail. And that's why many D&I programs do fail, is because they aren't communicated. Like you said, there isn't a context for people to understand, why are we doing this? And so really thinking about, how are you messaging this out as this being a benefit? How is this going to benefit the organization to create an inclusive environment?
Yeah, I think that's great, and it's interesting. We got a, not necessarily a question, which is why I'm going to raise it now, but a great comment. Why do you continue to call the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion a program? This is a common pitfall you seem oblivious to, and this certainly isn't my view. I think
Mhm.
part of my perspective is there needs to be an evolution of the way we look at diversity and inclusion, period. And I
Right.
think this is a great point, that just, the nuance of referring to it as a program, it is a mindset, and that needs to be integrated into the organization. It needs to be viewed as a strategic muscle that has to be constantly
Right.
exercised and flexed. And so just to clarify, many times though, companies are looking at this as a program or a solution. And the last point of the comment was, it's not a program that can be turned on and off when convenient or inconvenient. And I think that goes, your point around a strategy, there needing to be a concrete strategy that's
Mhm.
coming from, the executives of the company or the leadership of the company, is something that is needed to be successful. So I just thought that was a
Yeah.
great point, and
No,
thank you,
and it's so
anonymous
true,
attendee, for
because
sharing that.
yeah, it's so true, because we do use the language a lot, and we need to stop, is like, it is bigger than a program and bigger than just an initiative that has a start and end date. It needs to be woven into the core strategy. So when you align that strategy, and you just make it part of, when you align it with the overall company strategy, that's when you kind of like make it something that becomes part of the culture. But totally agree that, sometimes people will take those words, and like you said, there's a start and end date or an on and off switch, and that's just not, that's part of the reason they fail.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's keep moving on, because
Yeah.
we're, I made a promise to keep as much time open for Q&A. So what does success look like then? How do you think companies should measure success, and what are realistic expectations in terms of progress?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a hard one, right? Because at the end of the day, you are really kind of trying to change, belief systems and getting people to be more inclusive. You're getting people to want to feel a sense of belonging, and wanting them to feel like they can, bring their whole selves to work and add value. And, what happens is that people default to, oh, let's look at representation because we can measure representation. Oh, let's look at, certain things. So some things are easier, like, representation. Let's hire a bunch of Black and Latino and women and, other dimensions of diversity. And we can measure that and say, hey, we're doing really great. But at the end of the day, that number means nothing if you aren't really, doing anything with that diversity, if you aren't including them and fostering this environment of inclusion, and you aren't leveraging them in terms of, diversity of thought, and really trying to pull this into your, product development or service development, or just the way that you do business, right? So at the end of the day, you have to define what does success mean. And sometimes you really can't measure D&I. It's hard to measure D&I, but you have to agree upon what does success look like at the end. And, you have to be creative in the way that you are going to measure that. So at the end of the day, it may be a bunch of different metrics that, at the end of the day, if you know that you're aligning the diversity and inclusion strategy to creating more inclusive leaders and product managers and, service managers, then you're going to end up with an increased bottom line. So at the end of the day, it's different benchmarks that you would take. Is that like, how do we define that? And sometimes it is the internal employee surveys too, of how, how good are
Yeah.
your employees feeling? How happy are they? How satisfied are they? And using that as a metric, in addition to all of these other metrics. There isn't just one number that you're going to be able to say, hey, here's the ROI on it. It's very hard to measure that, and it's not going to be overnight. Like you said, it's not like you throw like, oh, we're going to increase our D&I budget by $1 million and I want to see, a return on investment of X amount. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, do you, and I promise I wouldn't do this, but Cindy once asked such a great question that is specifically related to what we're talking about now, that
Mhm.
I don't want to lose it or have to come back to it. So the question is, things like bottom line, revenue, market share aren't as relevant in the public and not-for-profit sectors. What other incentives for D&I do you suggest for those of us in those sectors? I'm just
Yeah,
curious
I
if you
mean,
have
so
any.
yeah, I mean, and that's a really great question. But at the end of the day, what is, what you have to do is sit down as, as a leadership team and say, okay, what is the outcome we want? And at the end of the day, what is the vision and the mission of the organization, be it a nonprofit, be it, whatever it is, like, how are they measuring success, right? And how can you align the initiative or the strategy that you roll out for D&I to impact that bottom line per se, right? So, if you have a nonprofit that is looking to, increase representation of, women here, or you're looking, your nonprofit is focused on, doing something specific, how do you measure success in that way? And how can you align your outcomes that you are reporting out for your D&I strategy to align with those outcomes? So, it's a hard question to ask, but at the end of the day, how do you measure success for the organization as a whole? For a lot of these other, organizations that you and I work with, it is their bottom line, the revenues, the P&L, that kind of stuff. So how do you align it to, how do you increase that particular, goal or perspective? So I would say for some of these nonprofits and these other organizations, it is a sense of, how are the individuals or the people working there, or the constituents, how are they feeling? But at the end of the day, is it helping move your, along to reach that mission and that goal, and making sure it's aligned to that strategy?
Yeah, we have a nonprofit that focuses in kind of social and healthcare type work, and
Mhm.
one of the things that they were finding is that there was a disconnect in the volunteers that they have working for them, and the way that they were serving their end customer,
Mhm.
who were typically low socioeconomic individuals,
Mhm.
and people from minority groups, so diverse ethnic groups. And
Mhm.
as a result, one of the metrics that they look like in terms of showing progress was customer patient satisfaction. Like,
Yes.
are we delivering a better experience to our customer who's diverse and is impacted by our need to make improvements internally in the
Yeah.
space? So all great points. As far as as far as ROI, I like this is something that is also, I just wanted to come back to that. I know you glaze over it.
Yeah.
Do you have any, because we work with a lot of, analytical and numbers minded people. Do you have any experiences based on some of the companies you work for, how that was approached? And it sounds like that may need to be a longer time horizon,
Yes.
3, 5, 10 years out. How, in your experience, how has that been approached?
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the easiest examples were, when I was at Google, we had started this idea of product inclusion. And what they meant by that is, unfortunately, kind of the same thing as, how there was this hyper focus now on D&I. The same thing happened internally. A lot of the times in organizations, the light bulb of like, oh, we need to do something doesn't happen until you get egg on face, right? Something happens. And, with product inclusion at Google, what it was is really was a response of, we'd been doing something all along. We hadn't gotten a lot of buy-in, but then there was the front page news a few years ago when Google launched their Photos app, and the algorithm was off and was labeling, Black Americans or people who were, using this as, monkeys, apes, and things like that. So of course, front page news, Google is racist, like all kinds of stuff. And then it turns out that it was an innocent mistake because there wasn't what we call product inclusion. There wasn't enough testing from diverse populations within the organization. And the issue is that they were like, oh, but we reached out like we always do and said, hey, help us test this to get the bugs out. Well, unfortunately, at organizations and like many tech firms, there's only 2% representation of, 2 to 3% representation of Black and Latinos in that organization. So there wasn't a lot of testing done with photos to fix the algorithm. So of course, they ran to the D&I teams. They partnered immediately with the Black Googler network, with the Latino network, with the Asian network. And they did a bunch of within 48 hours, a lot of testing, fix the algorithm. That's great. Well, Google had to turn around and go to the public and say, this was our fault. This was, our mistake because we were short-sighted and we weren't being as inclusive as possible. So now with product inclusion, it's become part of the whole product development process, right? You do this, and part of your test phase is to partner with diverse groups within the organization to make sure that you are creating a product that is going to be the best thing for the world. And so now you see where, in order for them to even record the ROI now, what they're saying is like, look, a great example is the assistant team came to the D&I team and said, hey, we want to do a hackathon because, for all intents and purposes, Alexa beat us to the market. But, one of the things that we hear is that people who have, English as a second language have really hard times for for Alexa or people to understand them. So we want to make the assistant a better product. So, right. At the end of the day, we have this much market share. Let's partner and let's make the assistant the best voice recognition tool out there that recognizes accents and all kinds of stuff. So they partnered with the Latino network, the Asian network, the Black network, and they made the assistant a, by far just, best in class program. And then when, of course, it rolled out, that was the feedback from the population and from the consumers, is that this, the assistant was really top notch. So now there was an increased market share, and they were able to say, because of the partnership with D&I and the product teams, we had an increase in that market share. We were able to claw back some of that we lost for hitting the market later. So you've got to be creative in the way that you do.
I was going to say that. Yeah, it sounds like,
so you have to sit there and say, what is the benchmark where we started? And then how can we kind of take that and say, it's not, this, in collaboration with, this is how we ended up with a better solution.
And I think that's a practical way of approaching it is, a snapshot in time and, coming back to, a similar set of data so that you can show meaningful progress.
Yeah.
Given that, some of the, some of the benefits are not going to be reflected as easily as we would like in terms of numbers. So,
yeah.
Well, I promised that we would save the last 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. We're a little late on that, but we've answered a few questions already, and the questions are starting to roll in, and there's some really good ones. So I am going to shift into the Q&A, and we're going to try to get through these as quickly as possible. So if you haven't submitted your question, please do. I'm also going to aggregate some of these so that we can try to hit as many as we can. There was we've had a lot of questions related to what data do we need to gather, what should be gathered, for informing, as inputs into your diversity and inclusion initiatives, and ultimately, rolling out your diversity and inclusion programs. What is a good, what would you say a good data set looks like? And how, what questions should our audience be asking to kind of formulate, what a survey may look like?
I mean, that's a great question. And Stephen, you could probably add as well when you're thinking about, what are some, you want to make sure that you're going to have a set of questions that you are going to be able to kind of replicate if you're doing certain things. So I've been in organizations where we make sure that we are, one, asking, in terms of career progression, like, do you feel like you are progressing in your career as equally or as steadily as your peers, and leaving it kind of like really trying to understand career progression, access to opportunity in terms of, how comfortable are you in navigating the organization? Do you know how to get ahead? Questions around making sure that you are feeling heard. Like, do you feel like your manager values your input and those types of things? So at the end of the day, it is coming down to, do people feel like they belong? Do people feel like there is a career path for them in the organization? Do people feel like they're being valued in what they're doing? And and as long as you have questions around those points, you're going to probably start uncovering some of those themes that you will see in terms of people feeling, people leave organizations because they feel like they stall out, or they feel like there's no one like them, so there's no sense of belonging, or at the end of the day, they feel like they're not being heard, so they're leaving a non-inclusive manager. So really, your questions should really try to hone in on, how are they experiencing the workplace in that regard.
Yeah, and just to quickly build off of that, and to kind of build off of what we've already talked about, you mentioned the importance of defining what diversity is for your organization,
Right.
what it means for your company, and that's really kind of the starting point. When that I would recommend when looking at what data set that you want to collect in terms of feedback. And the reason for that is, the acronym, DIBES, or diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. This space has evolved so much
Mhm.
over the last 30, 40 years, even more specifically the last 10 years. And so, and there's no wrong answer, there's no right or wrong. It's, in my opinion, it's what makes sense for your organization. Sometimes that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes that's diversity, inclusion, and belonging.
Right.
And I also share often with clients that it's never been easier to ask to put together a bad survey. And so you want to start with, what are the factors that we want to
Yes.
measure? Is it diversity and inclusion? And then there are a set of questions that you should ask to really dig into each of those areas that are part of your broader definition, that are going to be part of your diversity and inclusion strategy. And from there, that's how you're going to begin to formulate the design. One of the things that we believe that gathering data set is critical. Regardless of what system you use, there's a lot of great systems out there. You should be asking your questions specifically. Try not to ask one or two questions in your annual
Right.
engagement survey. It's not enough. And so we're happy to share the Workify baseline. And that's something that we will share with the recording of this session.
Yeah.
And so, there are any follow-up questions, we're always happy to help.
Yeah.
As far as, and I'm going to keep moving on the
Yeah.
questions here.
I do want to add something to that, Stephen. I think it's important too to think about, you shouldn't just have one set of like D&I reporting or whatnot, because when it comes to strategies, there's going to be different strategies. So I used to get it all the time. When I was head of diversity recruiting at Goldman, I used to get, well, they were like, well, part of D&I, is the Asian population. Why aren't you recruiting more Asians? And I'm like, well, when you look at the numbers, we don't have an issue in representation from Asians. But where we do look at the Asian, where we do look at those metrics is on, progression in career and performance and things like that, where we see a critical mass at the bottom. But when we see the leadership numbers, that number gets really small. We want to understand what that is. So we may not be measuring it for representation, or we may not be focusing on that population for representation and recruiting initiatives, but we are when it comes to career development and career progression. So you want to be careful in saying, you have to have one set of D&I numbers and you're looking at all of these dimensions, because then it kind of dilutes what it is that you're looking for. So you have to be very targeted and specific in what you're looking for, and understanding what's the outcome you're looking for. What are you trying to change, and making sure that you are being, deliberate in how you are sharing those numbers.
Well, I'm glad, and I agree with all those. I agree with all of those points. I'm glad you brought up the topic of talent acquisition. We have a question,
Mhm.
and man, this is just got the reality of, for so many companies. Anonymous attendee asks, my organization currently has a lack of diversity problem. There may be 4 to 6 minorities in our 100 plus organization. We're interviewing diverse talent, but our managers are not hiring them, choosing the white candidate every time. How can we sure we get diversity through the door? Man, I really, I feel for that, because
Mhm.
that is real. Like I've worked at organizations, and we have clients that are struggling with situations like this.
Mhm.
What having been in a diversity talent acquisition role, do you have any experience, strength, and hope that you can share?
Yes. So again, you have to be very deliberate in that sense, in that one, you need to make sure that the panel of reviewers, or the people who are actually interviewing and making the decision, that panel in and of itself is diverse, and that you are pulling in some diversity in that, because at the end of the day, we're all human, right? And, we relate to someone who looks like us, or who thinks like us, or who has something in common with us. So, at the end of the day, it could be school affiliation, it could be, any of those things, but it could be also, I'm male, I'm female, you're female, whatever it may be, there is that affiliation. So you have to make sure you have a diverse, slate of interviewers, right, who are going to be making the decisions. The other is that if what we had to start doing is having very strategic diversity and inclusion super day of interviews, where all we would bring in were the diverse candidates, and we would interview them all at the same time. Even if it wasn't because sometimes they would say, we don't really have people who are qualified to interview, we don't have a diverse slate. And it's like, okay, well then let's make all the candidates that you review on this particular day all diverse, and you choose the top talent that you identify at that point in time, to kind of get those diverse numbers in there. And we would do that purposely with, some of our diversity and recruiting strategies, where we would bring in and have very specific, it was kind of like a Latino student boot camp. So you'd bring all the Latino students in, and then the next day, they would have a set of interviews with key leaders, who would then extend offers to that particular group of
Mm,
people. So you start getting some of that diversity in there, even if there
mhm.
isn't a diverse slate of interviewers. The first, of course, is like, get diverse interviewers. If you can't do that, then be very strategic on saying, we're going to interview all of our women and diverse, people on a particular day, and make decisions from there, and be able to get some of those, those hires as diverse
Yeah,
hires.
yeah, I think that those are great practical solutions. And again, that's where the commitment,
Yes,
at
the
the
commitment has to
senior level of the organization, because it's hard to make that move of, this is, we have committed to we were committed to this as a company, and our CEOs behind this, and as a result, we are going to try these new tactics in
yes,
order to start meeting our goals. And
definitely.
so great feedback. There are several questions that I'm going to kind of lump into the same thing, and I know, I'm going to real time action the feedback from earlier around, using the word program. So but we've established a definition of diversity. We've established, what this will look like, what diversity and inclusion will look like organizationally at our company. Now it's time to start taking some action, and programmatically, I've got to start making some decisions. What do I do first? There are a lot of questions, and I'm guessing that our audience will not like the response they get, because it depends.
Yes.
But I guess, do you have any practical advice for those that are getting started, in terms of, where will I get the most, where will I see the best results in terms of, starting, to walk down this path of a more diverse and inclusive organization, programmatically speaking.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think ultimately, like you said, it does depend. But first and foremost, like you said, you have to roll out the context and the communication as to why the organization or why we're doing what we're doing, right? That we, in an effort to create a more inclusive, organization or work environment where everybody feels like they belong, we are going to be taking steps to introducing new initiatives and rolling out. I think at the end of the day, you do have to make an informed decision of where do you start. Sometimes, to be quite honest, it could be where's the low hanging fruit, right? What would be kind of something that you could do in the immediate future that would have a significant impact in the right direction, where your employees would feel like, okay, I'm starting to see some change and starting to see some real action. Because a lot of the times, you don't want to get caught in this rumination of, oh, we want to develop this strategy and this whole initiative and everything, and it's going to take us a couple of months to pull a committee together and think about this and then roll everything out. During that time, your organization, your people are going to feel like nothing is being done. The biggest thing I can tell you is transparency. Really, it's communication and transparency, letting them know what you're doing and being vulnerable as a leader sometimes and saying, listen, I'm in this with you. We're going to figure this out together. We are going to do the right thing, but we are going to do it, we've got to, like, and being able to say, we don't know what we're going to do right now. We just know we're going to do something that's going to benefit the organization and benefit you. And then being able to take those steps. In the past, D&I, and I think, Stephen, you can recall, where we used to hold these numbers really tight to our chest and not want anybody to know about them. And that transparency, it creates mistrust, and it creates this aura, this perception that, nothing is being done. But if you let them know that, like, here's where we are, here's the benchmark, it's ugly, and we want to move the needle. But we know that it's going to be kind of like an uphill battle, but join us in this and we will move it forward. But at the end of the day, the one thing that's going to help you the most is transparency. And transparency in that this is where we are, and then maintaining that trust by showing them that you are taking steps forward. And anytime that, it's this whole idea of trial and error, right? It's an evolution. You're innovating as an organization. And so you have to look at diversity and inclusion as an innovation process and saying, hey, we tried this, it didn't work. We're letting you know that. Now we're going to shift and do something different. So it's that level of transparency and the idea of embracing innovation and trial and error based on what your organization is telling you.
Yeah, and to share kind of the experience, to give the playbook that was applicable when I was a diversity officer for the real estate finance company. It was a business called Archon Group, based in Dallas, Texas. Very kind of conservative. And what we found, the first thing we did is we met with a cross section of the organization, and I started a conversation with them, like, what does diversity inclusion mean to you? Why do you think this should be, should this be a priority for our business? Why? If not, explain. And we gathered the data. So we took a top-down approach, and what we found was we needed to quickly shatter some old preconceptions around what an effort in diversity and inclusion was all about, rather than, our fear was we were going to be met with pockets of resistance. And so we quickly, we engaged a group of employees to help in the development of a definition. And we quickly put that together, had some help from marketing, rolled that out, and then put some training in place. And we tackled two levels of the organization. We had a what I will call like a diversity 101 program that was for the individual contributor level, and then we had a program, a training for the manager level, and executive level. And so those were the first two things that we did. We felt it was we weren't ready to jump into employee resource groups, but we did start. We did a quick assessment for what opportunities there were in, the campus hiring process. So we looked for where, in terms of talent acquisition, we could start to see some
Mhm.
progress and try some new programs or some new tactics. And so that's what we did. But it's hard to answer, and obviously there's a lot that goes into that, and we're running out of time.
Yeah.
In the last question that I wanted to flag, because or throw out, because I think it's something that we all struggle with, is in the absence of having a dedicated diversity and inclusion department, who's best to lead the effort? And if the answer is HR, like, how do you do this when, again, you don't have a dedicated team within HR? Like, I'm a scrappy small business. How do I move things forward?
Yeah. So I will say, and it sounds contrary to what most people are going to say, but it shouldn't be HR's job. It shouldn't be HR's job alone. It has to be the business leaders. You have to have buy-in from your senior business leaders who basically have bought in themselves and truly understand the benefits of having a diversity and inclusion strategy that helps the overall organization's bottom line or meet their vision and or their mission, right? And so the leaders are going to be the ones who are going to, influence the middle managers and those others who are trying to get the job done. If it's HR, you and all, all of us who are probably on this call are involved in HR, right? And we know how sometimes
Mhm.
HR is seen as like, the police or big brother or whatever we may be seen as. We're not necessarily always embraced by the organization.
Yeah.
D&I needs to be a partnership of HR and the business leaders. So if you don't have a D&I team, what you need to do is identify those diversity champions within your organization who are business leaders who will help you get that buy-in, who can help with that influence. And it just takes one or two to really kind of start leading the charge, and then get others to kind of, join as well, as to why it's important. And, I think as both Steve and I have shared, you really do have to think about D&I from a business perspective. How is D&I going to impact the business or the organization, be it a nonprofit or whatever it is, to help the mission move along forward? And if that's how you're going to get the buy-in from the business leader themselves. And so you have to be strategic in that way of saying, when people feel like they belong, when they bring their whole selves, are 30% more productive, hence we're going to be able to get to our bottom line or to our mission much faster. So really thinking about who are those people in the business that can help you move things along and help them, help themselves, in other words.
Wow. Well, great feedback. I really wish I could add my perspective, but folks, we unfortunately are out of time. Time flies. And
Yes.
I just wanted to wrap up our session by thanking all of you again for joining us today. A huge thanks to Monica for a wonderful conversation. We hope this has been useful and has provided you with some effective strategies for launching diversity and inclusion at your company. Thank you all. And yes, we will be sharing the recording of this video, and as well the survey baseline, the index of questions that I referred to earlier. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks so much.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Bye.